All right, now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Um, we're going to move from the branding and media space to cultivation. In the market, we are seeing more and more advanced cultivation as businesses are trying to produce cannabis in the most efficient way possible. Ryan Douglas will be joining us today to talk about new technology in cannabis cultivation. Ryan has worked in commercial horticulture for 23 years and specializes in legal cannabis startups. Prior to entering the cannabis industry, Ryan spent 15 years as a commercial greenhouse grower of ornamental and edible crops. As master grower from 2013 to 2016, Ryan directed cultivation for Tweed Inc., Canada's largest licensed producer of medical cannabis and the flagship subsidiary of Canopy Growth or Corporation. Ryan now cultivates in Colombia and provides startup advice to groups launching cultivation projects in newly regulated countries.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk today. My name is Ryan Douglas. I'm a cultivation consultant. I specialize in legal cannabis startups. I live and work here in Colombia, but I consult internationally. Um, Prior to entering the cannabis industry, I was a commercial greenhouse cultivator of ornamental and edible crops. And in that world, growers use new technology with the goal of lowering production costs or increasing crop quality or improving profitability. And so, in my opinion, cannabis should be no different, really, as conventional agriculture advances with technology and develops new technology. I think cannabis should benefit right alongside with it, and that's kind of the reason for my presentation today. So I'm not only thrilled to talk about cultivation in Latin America, but especially interested in speaking about new cultivation technology. So I'll jump right into things. And really, the guiding question, the big question is, why is new technology important for Latin American cannabis cultivators, really? Why does it matter? And so there's a handful of reasons why we should consider implementing new technology for new cultivations in Latin America and Mexico. The first is the trend towards larger farms. So, as we'll see in the near future, in Central South America and some more tropical regions, the tendency is going to be for larger and larger farms. So, if we just look at Colombia, for example, where I live and consult a lot, new companies, new licensed producers are starting with areas that are 1 to 10 hectares in size. So that's 100,000 square feet to 1 million square feet of production to begin with, right? And so a lot of these companies have plans to expand beyond that. So one of the reasons new technology will be critical for Latin American cultivators is these growers need help successfully managing really large cultivations of several hectares or hundreds of thousands of square feet. Another reason new technology will be important is the pressure to keep the cost of production very low for cannabis. So low cost of production is actually one of the driving forces for companies to set up commercial cultivation operations in other countries. It's the driving force. That's the reason why a lot of foreign investment from the US, Canada, and Europe is coming to Central and South America, is the low cost of production. So if you think in places that are highly regulated with all four seasons, the cost of production is easily $1-2 a gram for dried flower. In the US, it's a bit less regulated. In some states where the temperature is more conducive to growing cannabis, you can get closer to probably 40, 50, 60 cents a gram. But in Central and South America, 10, 15, 20 cents a gram per dried flower is realistic, and it's the goal for a lot of companies. So utilizing technology in any way possible to help maintain a low cost of production is going to be critical over the coming years. Another additional reason to incorporate new technology is the constant pressure of insect and disease. So in my experience, I've grown in several different countries. I've grown different crops. And here in South America, there's basically every insect and disease you could imagine, and a lot of them like cannabis. So it's an increased challenge in places like the US, Canada, Europe. At the very least, growers get the winter. And winter is like the great equalizer. It kills everything, or everything goes dormant, and everyone starts on the same footing in the spring. But in places like Colombia and Central South America, there's never winter. So there's a lot of insect pressure, a lot of disease pressure, and it's difficult for cannabis cultivators because we're very restricted on the kind of pest control products we can use, like insecticides or fungicides. We're held to a standard that's higher than most organic cultivators, simply for the fact that prior to consuming a vegetable or fruit, you can wash it before consuming it. With cannabis, that's not the case. So any technology that could help a farmer mitigate or prevent insect or disease infestations is going to be extremely beneficial. And the final point is actually kind of a summary of the previous three, is that because cannabis has been illegal for decades, there really are no companies that are cultivating a large scale in Central America or South America or even other tropical areas successfully. So what we don't have are large farms that are essentially organically grown, that successfully manage disease, that successfully manage insects, and that repeatedly have large harvests of cannabis. No one's doing it yet because it's been illegal across most of the globe. So those companies that actually can incorporate new technology to successfully grow cannabis crops on a large scale in Central, South America, and other tropical climates will be cannabis pioneers industry-wide and across the globe, because no one is doing that yet. So new technology can actually help farmers achieve that goal in the very near future. So that's kind of a bit of a background on why we should consider new technology, really the reason I'm talking about this today. So specifically, I'm going to address a couple different areas of new technology that can be of benefit to cannabis growers. So that's going to be drones, shade covers, and the use of sensors and camera technology. So first, drones. Why even consider it? What do drones have to do with cannabis, and how can it help a cannabis cultivator? So actually there's a handful of reasons, multiple reasons. First would be soil and field analysis. So this is really referring to prior to planting a crop. Farmers can utilize drones with cameras to really identify soil quality. So in terms of poor drainage or kind of dead zones, it helps farmers to really manage their planting and growing schedule or scheme for the coming year. Another option is seed planting and actually reseeding. If you can picture a cannabis farm of about 10 hectares, farmers are most likely going to begin that crop either planting the seed directly into the ground or planting transplants. In the event they use seeds, directly planting seeds, it's not unsimilar to other crops like wheat or grain, where they just have a whole lot of seed, they plant it, and within a week or two it begins to sprout. Now they lose some of those seeds for weather-related issues or for birds and animals. And so what drones can do in this instant is first do the initial seeding of the entire field. Some drones can hold up to a payload of 50 or 60 pounds, which means they could hold 50 pounds of seeds, or they could hold half of that in seed and half water. And so they're actually doing this automatic planting. So that's one option. But a more realistic use would actually be reseeding. So in the instance, a large field is seeded. A week or two later, most of those will come up. There's going to be bare patches. And if untouched, those bare patches could result in unused space of 10, 15, 20, 25% of the entire field. So drones could be used to actually identify bare patches in the field and actually seed those spaces. So the plants will be maybe a week or two behind, but by the time harvest comes around, the difference will be negligible, but the field will be actually much more efficient in terms of production capacity. For irrigation management, it's not realistic to utilize drones for irrigation because cannabis uses a lot of water and a drone can only hold so much water. Where it's more useful is actually identifying wet spots in the field that don't need constant irrigation, so the farmer can use less water growing that crop. And it could also, on the contrary, identify hot spots, kind of dry spots, areas on the farm that dry out quicker than other areas, either due to soil composition or maybe wind conditions. So the drone can identify areas that dry out quicker. And so if there's an irrigation system, the farmer can only irrigate that dry area or irrigate it more frequently as opposed to irrigating the entire field. It also can be used to identify leaks or problems in the irrigation system, if there's puddling or any kind of damage to the irrigation system. Crop mapping and surveying really has to do with more monitoring the canopy health or the crop health in general. So farmers can utilize near infrared image cameras to really create a report essentially of crop health. So based on the light absorption, the different color of the crop, from a bird's eye view, the farmer can identify where there's potentially nutrient deficiencies or toxicities. It essentially creates a richer overall picture of crop health. Flowering cycle interruption, this is an interesting one. As you likely know, cannabis is what's called a short day plant, so it flowers when the night is really long. Now, the challenge is in areas where people are cultivating outdoors, several hectares, whether it's direct seeded or started from transplant, that plant, the cannabis plant, needs to grow vegetatively up to a certain size where it's appropriate to begin flowering. Now, in places, depending on the latitude, in places where the sunlight is naturally 12 hours, it's sufficient for excellent plant growth, but the problem is the night is 12 hours also. And unless we interrupt that long, dark night cycle, the flower is going to begin flowering. So here in Colombia, for example, every day the sun rises at 6 and it sets at 6. So we have a 12-hour night cycle. Now, if we planted seeds directly outdoors or planted a seedling directly outdoors, it's going to start flowering immediately when the plant is only a few inches tall, which means the harvest will be when the plant is about 5 or 6 inches tall, which really is not very efficient. So we need to break that night cycle. So where drones can come in handy in this area is really prevent the necessity of having to install massive lighting infrastructure in the middle of a farm. So you're talking about posts, you're talking about lamps, you're talking about a lot of cable. We're talking about bringing electrical service to the middle of a farm field where otherwise there is nothing there. But there's not too many options in terms of providing light in the middle of the night for a big crop of cannabis, except with drones. What is an option is to simply attach a light on the bottom of that drone and have one or several drones throughout the night fly over the crop. The plant only needs maybe 10 or 15 minutes of light during the entire night to disrupt that flowering cycle. So as opposed to installing this massive lighting infrastructure, which is expensive and time consuming, with just a handful of drones with lights attached to the bottom, they could achieve the same goal throughout the night in a much more efficient and less expensive manner. And finally, pest and disease management. I've highlighted this one because, in my opinion, this is the greatest challenge for cannabis growers on a commercial scale, is the management of pests and diseases. And we'll take a look here a little bit more deeply to see exactly how drones could be a benefit to cannabis growers in this way. So one is pesticide application. When we speak about pesticides, that's a general word that refers to insecticides, fungicides, really any pest control product. And so what drones can do to help farmers cultivating cannabis on a commercial scale is, one, to identify early outbreaks. And once those outbreaks are identified, really just spot spraying in the area of the field where there's trouble. So normally if there's pest pressure, or if someone has farmed in that area long enough, they know at a certain point in the crop cycle there's going to be a pest or disease pressure. So kind of the old-fashioned way of doing things is to spray the entire field preventatively, or once there is a breakout, spray the entire field, right, to try to bring things under control. But it uses a lot of pest control product, a lot of chemical, a lot of material. It requires a lot of labor, and it requires the equipment, whether it's backpack sprayers or tractor sprayers. And so it's not very efficient, it's not very specific, and it can be expensive. So with the drones, by identifying the hot spots, we can treat those hot spots with the idea of helping it prevent from spreading and infecting the rest of the crop without us having to spray the entire crop. So along those same lines, biocontrol application, this refers to the application of beneficial insects to the crop. So this is quite basically establishing a population of beneficial insects that eat damaging insects, insects that will damage the cannabis crop. So inside of a greenhouse, or maybe inside of a grow room, this is a pretty easy task. But once we're talking, 1, 5, 10 hectares of production and really big plants, it becomes a challenge. Even distribution of the insects and getting them where they need to be. So this is where drones come into play. And you can see from the middle photo, this is roughly the size of the drone that's being used today for biocontrol application. Looks like really any other drone you've seen. The difference is you've got kind of a piece of equipment on the bottom that is used to evenly distribute the insects. And you can see in the containers below the clone that the insects are so small they come mixed with a carrying agent like vermiculite or like sawdust, anything that can help evenly distribute and spread those insects. So the benefit of using drones for the application of this material is reduced labor, and it's faster. So instead of having employees walking down rows, hectares and hectares of rows, and applying this stuff and then refilling and applying again, it's simply a faster method of doing it, so you're spending less money on labor. It also can guarantee a more even and thorough distribution over large areas. So just by the nature of human error, employees are likely going to apply too much in some areas, maybe not enough in other areas. When they go back and refill, they might even skip some areas, so it's pretty inconsistent. And with these drones, because it's all programmed, we can guarantee an even distribution over large areas of cultivation. It also allows us to access challenging terrain. So Colombia is a perfect example. Colombia is a very mountainous country. And so we've got cannabis cultivations. It's not often is it perfectly flat. We've got farmers that are working with the natural contour of the land. So depending on how steep the land is and how tall the plants are, getting an even distribution of beneficial insects on these plants in challenging terrain is difficult. But with a drone, since it's all done overhead, it's not a problem at all. So whether it's very steep slopes or maybe even waterlogged areas where people or tractors can't get to for application, for the drone, it's not a problem. You can guarantee consistency and even distribution in those areas. And kind of along those lines, also it makes the application to tall crops much easier. So in some cannabis or hemp cultivations, the planting density is really tight, and as a result, the plants grow really tall, and oftentimes they'll grow taller than the average height of the employee. So it makes scouting certainly a challenge, but applying beneficial insects to something you can't reach is almost impossible. So just one more way that a drone can help ensure even distribution of the biocontrol material. So physical eradication, this is up and coming. It's more of an experiment at the moment, but in my opinion, it shows a lot of promise. And it's a very unique, interesting way to attack insects. And so this is based out of the Netherlands, where they're doing research. And it's essentially using drones to impact or use the propellers to damage insects. And so in this instance, they're experimenting with moths. So in these two photos on the slide, on the top is a chrysanthemum crop, and on the bottom is a gerbera crop, both of which are susceptible to damage from caterpillars. So as we know, caterpillars come from moths, right? The moths fly over the crop, They deposit the eggs on the leaf or in the soil, and then the resulting caterpillars either kind of bore into the center of the plant or they start eating away at the leaves, which causes damage. And cannabis is susceptible to damage from caterpillars. So what these folks are doing is experimenting with mini drones. And what they have inside of a greenhouse, this really, I don't think is feasible outdoors, but inside large greenhouses, really they concentrate all the intelligence of the system in a base station. And this station detects the movement of a moth, and then it sends out these mini drones to hit it and use the propellers to destroy the wing of the moth. So essentially it's physical eradication. And if you can imagine, in a large greenhouse, you'd have a couple of these base stations, but then perhaps dozens of these miniature drones flying around attacking moths. So they still have a lot of kinks to work out of the system, right? There's a lot of stuff in the greenhouse to avoid, including employees. But in terms of organic pest control, it's promising. I think it could work. It'll take a couple years to develop, but I really think they're onto something here. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. Okay, so on to the second subject, shade covers. What is the big deal? I mean, we're talking about new technology for cultivation, but shade covers they've been in use for decades, right? Any greenhouse in any country that's warm, or even in the US and Canada and Europe, any place that has summer, you're going to find a shade cloth inside of a greenhouse. So how is this considered new technology? Which is an excellent question. So what most of us are familiar with today are really two types of shade covers, shade cloths, black and white. So the black shade covers are used for creating shade. They don't really do too much to lower the temperature inside of a growing area, but they do provide shade for plants that can't take direct sunlight. The other type of shade cover is white, and that actually does serve more to decrease the temperature in a growing area. Because the shade cover is white, it actually reflects the light, so the light and the heat energy doesn't enter the growing area. It actually is reflected, so it provides some shade, but mostly keeps the temperature of the growing area a little bit lower. So that's what we're familiar with. Anyone that has worked in greenhouses or done growing, shade cover is not a new concept, and usually they're either black or white. So the reason I'm speaking about that today is that, in my opinion, in the future, the movement is going to be more towards what's called photoselective shade netting. And that's utilizing different colors of shade netting, not just to provide shade or decrease temperature, but actually to manipulate the growth of the plant or the characteristics of that plant, and to repel insects or prevent disease. So really at its most basic, we're talking about using different colors of shade cloth to address different challenges. So either the form of the plant growth or actually what the plant produces. In our case, we're talking about cannabinoids. It's also been shown to prevent insects or prevent disease. So one interesting article, this was published in a Greenhouse and Crop Production magazine back in 2008. So I mean, we're talking about new technology. This research, the idea has been around for a while, but I'm confident in the next few years it's really going to come to light. And if you're interested, the article is photoselective shade netting integrated with greenhouse technologies for improved performance of vegetable and ornamental crops. And so through a series of experiments with different crops, they found some very promising, interesting results. So one is that they were able to actually increase the productivity of leafy crops. So that could prove beneficial for cannabis growers in terms of creating a leafier or more robust vegetative cannabis plant. They also found that the flowers per stem increased when the color of the shade was manipulated. So in their experiment, they were using cut flowers, but for cannabis growers as well, a flower set is critically important because it's directly related to the harvest at the end of that cannabis crop. And this research also found that playing with different colors actually decreased insect infestations by either repelling them or confusing them. So very exciting, very interesting in my opinion. And I think what we'll see in the future is actually this is what large commercial greenhouse operations are going to resemble. Because again, as cannabis growers, we're limited on our fungicide and pesticide options. And so everything we do has to essentially be organic. And so whether we're talking about mini drones attacking moths, or we're talking about changing the color of our shade curtains, these are 100% organic methods to either prevent or mitigate disease or insect infestation. So if you look at this photo on the left, you've got a greenhouse that's using 3 different colors of shade, and even the green shading has two different shades. So I think what we'll see in the future is different colored shade cloths for different stages of the cannabis production cycle, as well as different colors depending on the insect or disease threat for that specific region. So the last point I want to talk about is the use of sensors and cameras for managing crop quality. So how can they really help cultivators in Latin America and Mexico? What is the benefit of using sensors and cameras in cannabis cultivation? So one is to help reduce the carbon footprint. So it's no secret that cannabis is a pretty resource-intensive crop. So it needs a lot of sun, it needs a lot of water, it needs a lot of nutrients. And depending where you're growing, it could also require a lot of supplemental light or heat, carbon dioxide, dehumidification. And so what sensors and cameras can help growers do is really not to overshoot or use excess amounts of resources in cultivating the plants, really to help fine-tune the needs and timing so that farmers can provide just what the plant needs exactly when it needs it, and they're not wasting money and resources on electricity or water or nutrients. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into that here in a second. So reduce water usage, it's kind of the same thing, just watering the plant when the plant needs water, not excessive amounts of water, because in a lot of areas the water is a precious resource, and there's restrictions in terms of what kind of agricultural sites can use how much water and when. And of course, easy identification and resolution of crop problems. So it's a little bit similar to how drones can provide farmers kind of a richer picture of the overall crop quality. So there's a kind of some general areas where sensors and cameras can be of use, and I'll dive into just 3 right here before I finish my talk. So water sensors, these are also called moisture meters. This is pretty common equipment. By itself, it really just monitors the amount of water inside of a given substrate. So either a cocoa fiber, a pot of cocoa fiber, or a Rockwell cube, or even an entire bed of plants. It is basically an indicator of how much water is in that substrate. So by itself, it doesn't do too much, but when this technology is linked to irrigation equipment, what you can do is actually automate a very large area of cultivation and provide water just when the plant needs it. So when we talk about eliminating the risk of irrigating too much or too little, if you look at the picture here on my slide, this is a typical cannabis greenhouse, and you're going to have tens of thousands of plants, oftentimes several varieties and several stages of growth. And as a plant grows, its water requirement varies. So you've got a lot of variables, and you've got the constant growth and movement of the plant. So every day is a new assessment in terms of when and how much to water. And when we talk about large scale facilities, 20, 25 people per hectare, you've got a lot of people trying to guess when to water the crops, and it can be a difficult challenge. So the risk is irrigating too much or too little. Both of those are going to affect plant health, which directly affects the harvest, really. So by using water sensors and connecting it with an irrigation system, we eliminate the inconsistency that is just human nature, really. It comes along with human error, right? You've got so many variables, a lot of changes. Even if it's the same employee, oftentimes there's inconsistency in terms of when crops are irrigated or how they're irrigated. And eliminating guesswork, it kind of, I guess, goes along with that. If it's 3:30 in the afternoon, do you water, or is it too close to night? Do we wait till the next day? Do we water a little bit? Do we water a lot? So if we can eliminate watering too much, or watering too little, or watering inconsistently, or just eliminating all of the guesswork surrounding this, really what it does is encourage a healthier crop, right? So overwatering plants can produce problems with roots. It can kill roots, and as a result, a disease can start to eat away at the plant. Irrigating too little, drying up the crop, also can compromise really the overall health of the plant, which in the end influences the harvest. So water sensor is pretty basic, but when you hook it up, when it's connected to irrigation system, can be a very useful tool in terms of managing irrigation and water inside of a greenhouse. So another technology that's becoming more and more popular today are vapor pressure deficit sensors. Vapor pressure deficit is a relatively new terminology for cannabis growers. It's simply a more exact way of managing humidity in the environment. So it's really, if we dig into it, it's pretty technical and almost warrants a whole nother talk on its own. But what this does is measure the difference between the water pressure inside of the leaf to the amount of moisture in the air to the amount of moisture the air could hold. So it gets a bit complicated. Just the sensor alone really doesn't do too much. You've got to compare it to a chart like I have here on my slide. But again, if we can connect these vapor pressure deficit sensors to either misting equipment or ventilation equipment, what it does is automate the process and really take the guesswork out of managing the humidity in the environment. So really the standard way of managing the environment now is most growers just pay attention to the temperature and the relative humidity. But like the name implies, relative humidity is relative to the temperature of the air. So hot air can hold a lot of water, cold air holds less. And so vapor pressure deficit is a way of managing the humidity independent of the temperature of the growing space. And so what that comes down to essentially is healthier plants, a better management of water resources, and essentially the prevention of disease and infections, because really the whole reason we're managing humidity is to prevent two of the biggest diseases that attack cannabis, which is powdery mildew and botrytis. So in an area that's too humid, right, there's a greater chance of a disease infestation on that crop. And on the flip side, if the atmosphere is too dry, the plant is taking up a ton of water, transpiring a ton of water, and there's a risk of some nutrient toxicity in the leaves, because as the plant takes up a lot of water, it's also taking up a lot of minerals, and it's being sent out to the leaves to transpire, and a lot of those minerals accumulate in the tips and the edges of the leaves, so it creates what appears to be mineral toxicity in the plant. So all kinds of reasons to try to manage the humidity of a greenhouse and the watering as well. So the final piece of technology I'll speak about are mobile greenhouse cameras. It's very similar to a drone outdoors, but in the greenhouse, this is basically used to monitor crop health from a bird's eye view. So in a typical greenhouse, these are mounted below the equipment, like the lights and the gutters and the shade curtains. So below the equipment, but above the crop. And it simply runs back and forth on a rail, and they have a charging station. But these can run 24/7. And the benefits that a grower could realize from incorporating this technology into a greenhouse is really saving time and labor. Right, so when we think again that the tendency, the trend in Central and South America, certainly in Mexico, is going to be larger farms. And so outdoors, of course, but also indoors. So because of the growing environment, we don't need as much heating and supplemental lighting. So the greenhouses in Central and South America are and will continue to be pretty basic structures, but they're big. And so it would be ideal for this kind of technology is to install this rail over a large space and just have these cameras run back and forth all day long, really one camera per bay. And so it's going to save time and labor from scouting from plants. It'll help reduce crop waste, because growers will be able to identify potential outbreaks early and treat them before it affects the entire greenhouse. But what's really interesting is the ability to generate reports, and reports that are useful to the grower. And what's exciting is that because it's a camera component, it is a camera, there's the option to essentially record all day, every week during the crop cycle. And it gives the grower the ability to review how did the crop grow. I mean, we could use time-lapse images of an entire greenhouse bay and really try to identify ways where we could be more efficient as growers, or anything we could change that might increase the health of the plant or the efficiency of the greenhouse or the productivity of the plant. So in conclusion, I think that Latin American cannabis cultivators are really well positioned to take advantage of some new technology. And this isn't necessarily technology for cannabis, it's technology for conventional agriculture. But there's no reason that we as cannabis growers can't take advantage of the same technology and implement it for our use. Right, and as I mentioned, there's a couple reasons why we have a responsibility to consider this technology, because one, the farms are going to be large, hectares and hectares, 100,000 to 1 million square feet or more. So there's going to be pressure to manage really large facilities well. Also, as I mentioned before, the pressure to keep production costs low, 10, 15, 20, 25 cents a gram. And of course, the pest and disease pressure is going to be extremely strong. So any of this technology that can help growers cultivate on a large scale, keep production costs low, but also effectively manage pest and disease pressure is going to allow a lot of these up and coming companies in Central and South America to be pioneers in the cannabis industry and the cannabis space. So no one's really doing it yet on a large scale. I'm sure in the next couple of years we'll see some of the bigger players, the more successful players. And once they have these protocols, once they have a design or a plan on how to grow effectively in Central America, South America, or tropical climates, it's going to be easier to duplicate that globally in new countries. So it'll be exciting to be a cannabis pioneer. And folks, with that, I end my discussion. I appreciate your time today, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, we're live with Ryan Douglas. Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for that presentation. We have some questions for you now to answer.
Great.
Okay. So the first questions, I actually have two questions about the screens, about the shading screens. One is, are the greenhouse shading one of the most affordable option to manipulate crops, or is it expensive?
So, well, that's a great question. So I think it's more affordable because when we consider the other options for manipulating crop growth, we're looking at manual labor in terms of pinching or pruning or deleafing, or we're looking at products that you apply to the plant either as a spray or a drench in the soil. So you're talking about a good amount of product that you're purchasing or a lot of labor that you're utilizing. So when you think about a screen, it's a one-time purchase, and these will last upwards of 5 to 7 years. So it's a one-time purchase, it stays in place, and it's pretty economical in my opinion.
Perfect. Okay. So the other question about the screens is someone wants to know what material they're made out of.
So I'm not sure exactly what you would call it. It's a combination of plastic and sometimes a very fine wire even. But the exact kind of plastic, I'm sorry, I don't know what it's made of. But the majority of shade cloths or screen covers are a combination of a plastic and really thin wire.
Perfect. Good answer. Okay. Your next question is someone wrote that I hear there is moisture is a big problem for the cannabis flower. Is most cannabis grown in closed greenhouses in Colombia?
No, no. So it's actually the opposite. Most cannabis is grown in very open air greenhouses. And so the reason is the climate here is ideal for cultivating cannabis. So what would be inappropriate or really over the top in terms of expenditure is to create an entirely closed greenhouse, because you would be expending a lot more money on cooling it and dehumidifying it or heating it. So because the night temperature and the day temperature is perfect for cannabis, most of these greenhouse structures are basically open air structures with a solid roof to protect the plant from rain.
Okay, great. Okay, so the next question, and I don't know how much you can speak to Mexico, but this person asked, they said Mexico has low wages like in Colombia, and also Mexico has a lot of different climates. And they asked, not counting the 12-hour light cycle, what other competitive advantages do you see for Mexico?
So Mexico is going to be right in line with Colombia and South Africa. And so you've got the ideal growing climate, you've got a lot of sun, relatively low wages, so the cost of production is low. In terms of an advantage, the only advantage I could see is that, at least in Colombia, the process of licensing commercial cultivators is pretty slow. The government seems bogged down with literally thousands of license applications, and I don't think they have the capacity to vet these operations or enforce the policies they've created. So the one advantage that Mexico could have is if they actually moved faster than Colombia did, right? So in a sense, you could have a Colombia that implemented the program earlier, but was and still is very slow to actually get it launched. So if Mexico actually came to the table and put things into play much quicker, you could have a lot of serious competition in Mexico just because the laws allowed for it. But I've been to several different greenhouse operations in Mexico, not cannabis, but there's a lot of ideal growing areas in Mexico. So it's without question going to be one of the biggest competitors globally for commercial cannabis production.
Definitely. Very well said. Okay, so I think I have one more question here. This person asked that you mentioned water usage. What other crop can be compared to cannabis in terms of water usage?
Let's see. So tomatoes would probably be the closest. So both tomatoes and cannabis grow quickly, and it's a pretty big plant. So there's some smaller ornamental plants like hydrangeas that actually require a lot of water. Even the word hydrangea, part of it is hydration. So, but it's a relatively small plant compared to cannabis and tomatoes. So in terms of aggressiveness and the rate of growth, I think tomatoes are a pretty appropriate crop to compare to cannabis in terms of water usage.
Okay. Great answer. And we had one more question come in when you were talking, and this question is about Argentina. And they asked, how do you see Argentina for large crops that are being carried out?
So I've yet to visit Argentina, but I imagine that the terrain is similar to Colombia in that you're going to have some flat areas and some mountainous areas. And so the most important factor to consider is going to be the region where you establish production. So if you're able to identify an area in Argentina where it's relatively temperate, so if you think the ideal temperature range for cannabis is between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is 68 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So the closer you get to identifying a spot where the temperature range stays that all year round, it's going to be easier to produce and less expensive to produce cannabis. So I haven't been to Argentina, but I'm positive somewhere in that country there's a region where that range is held throughout the year, and likely there's already commercial vegetable or flower crops that are being grown there already. So that would be an area. If I was in Argentina looking to establish cannabis cultivation, I would look to see where there's other similar crops being grown already.
That sounds like great advice. Well, that's all the questions that we have for you today. So we'll let you go, and thank you so much for your presentation and for coming to chat with us and answer our questions about cultivation.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.